So tell me when I've had 10 minutes. Yeah, that's my Twitter handle if you want to tweet. I'm here in a personal capacity. We have colleagues working both in Israel and in Gaza right now who I take no responsibility for what I say. Channel 4 takes no responsibility for what I say. And I work under not just the normal disciplines of a journalist, which require impartiality, but also the disciplines of public sector broadcasting, which in Britain require that we do not express views on political matters in any sense. So what I'm about to say is to try and basically offer evidence, the same kind of evidence that I would give if there was an ICC investigation or any other kind of investigation, including in Israel by the Israeli Defense Force disciplinary wing. How does this work? How do I go forward? How do I make it go forward? How do I make this go forward? There. Okay. So I was in Gaza from the 27th of July to the 5th of August. We went in and came out during temporary ceasefires. But the red box represents when I was there. The yellow graph is the death toll. And because when we went in, this was the week after Shaja'iyya, we thought there was some exhaustion and that there might indeed be a ceasefire. It was indeed a bit of a shock to be there in what turned out to be some of the most intense days in terms of death of the fighting. So what I want to talk about are potential breaches of international law in war. I'm not going to say here, if I do inadvertently say, then I will withdraw. I'm not going to accuse anybody of breaching international law. I'm going to raise issues where I think it is important for these, for potential breaches to be investigated. And as you'll see, what I think the problem is that the potential breaches go beyond individual ones. So, of the first order are and I'll come to a specific example of this, but reckless and disproportionate shelling of civilian areas, leading to large-scale loss of mainly civilian life. That is one thing that I think all of us who cover the conflict saw. And I start with this because a lot of the spectacular events are, you know, the MK-84 bombs and the missile strikes look and sound spectacular, but I think it is this, the shelling of supposed targets in civilian areas that I think has caused, and I would welcome any breakdown, loss of life on a far greater scale than could be justified by military conflict. Let's remember here, when we speak of potential breaches of the law in war, we are talking about the supposition is that some war is legal, that some war is justified, that some military action can be justified legally. So when we concentrate on breaches of the law in war, we have to make that assumption whether or not you individually agree with that assumption. The second thing is the targeting of supposed resistance targets, regardless of the proximity of densely packed refugee centres. I'll come to a specific example in the UNRWA school at Jabalya, but there was a similar one in the UNRWA school at Rafah while we were there, and I spoke to casualties of that, of both indeed. In addition to recklessly firing high explosive ordnance into civilian areas, there is this specific problem of targeting supposed resistance fighters in proximity to very densely packed refugee centres. On top of that, a different kind of military action, which is targeted strikes, either by F-16 or by drone strike, on family homes where family members are certain to be killed. We've already seen a list of them. So these are a different kind of thing. And the potential breach of law in war here is clear, because if you kill one guy and 27 members of his family and accept the likelihood that 27 people are going to die in that strike, then you have to justify it. It's military necessity. And I think that is an area that I would want to see the IDF and the international community go through. Incidentally, while we're talking about the evidence, we are being presented with evidence such as we have. The Israelis have a blimp and 2 drones circling at all times. What that means is they have at least three, points of triangulation for every single thing that goes on in the theatre of war. That means probably it would be entirely possible to rerun the tape on the entire 50 days, bit by bit, and data crunch it for every impact. There's no mystery about what has happened. It is all recorded. Now, second list. I think we've already heard about the arbitrary kill zones. I'll talk a bit about seeing the results of that at Khazar. Destroying the civil and physical infrastructure, so the attack on the power station, I witnessed that close up, which destroyed the electricity. The attack on mosques, which is also specifically designated, attacks on places of worship, is specifically listed as a potential war crime. Under international law. Remember as well that big mosques, such as the ones that were flattened in Gaza City that I saw, are also very important areas of social infrastructure. They feed people, in addition to praying. Then there's the issue of collective punishment. I think I would say the bombardment of Gaza City on the night of the 27th, on the 28th, the Monday, which I lived through, felt to me like collective punishment. There were leaflets dropped saying leave when people had moved to Gaza City out of the areas like Shajair, Zaytun and Jabalya already to try and get out of them. Having done that, there was a mixture of highly targeted high explosives onto specific targets and just relentless explosions, some of which were flares, some of which did not seem to me to be flares, they seemed to be high explosives. The end result was to terrify an entire city. And that's one act of collective punishment. The other one, I think, and if there's time I'll come to it, is the attack on Rafah after the 1st of August, Friday the 1st of August. We made repeated attempts to get to Rafah during that attack, but because we had good Palestinian contacts speaking to us in real time via text message and phone, it seems possible to me that the attack on Rafah, which lasted about 48 hours after the supposed abduction of the Israeli soldier, Lieutenant Goldin, looked like an act of collective punishment. The warning leaflets, we saw numerous examples of warning leaflets dropped by F-16 into areas saying leave them. Having seen these dropped onto an area that had just been bombed, rang the Israelis and said, what is the, how do you define East Jabalya? How do you define East Khan Yunis? What is the border of which the people I'm speaking to are supposed to move across? And of course, they could not define that. And in any case, they do not indemnify any military force having leafleted an area saying you must leave, or as in the case of the attack on Jabalya, we will attack you mercilessly, does not indemnify you from international law if you then kill civilians. I think another thing that hasn't been really mentioned so far, but I want to point to, is the extension of the occupation into airspace. I covered and had contact with British military over their use of drones. They use drones with, a lawyer on the end of a phone. They're very aware of the international law with regard to it. But they will insist drones ultimately are just the same as a form of air war. When you're on the receiving end of it, it strikes me that it's not that it feels more like an extension of policing. But of course, the policing is not accountable. So air strikes by drones on individual militant, alleged, resistance fighter targets are, of course, an act of war. But the problem is there is no accountability for the civilian population on the ground. And I think a lot of mental stress and trauma is being caused by the extension of the occupation into the airspace of Gaza. It effectively means any part of the airspace of Gaza at any time, including right now, can be hit arbitrarily. And believe me, even if you are a Western journalist, you are white, you have your head torch on, it's night, you are clearly identified, press with a flak jacket. As you walk home in the dark and you hear those things, all you're relying on is some kid on a laptop not misidentifying you, because you will never know if he doesn't, if he misidentifies you, as we saw in the famous WikiLeaks video of what happened in Baghdad. That's what happens. So moving on, I think we have to mention two, very specific areas of potential breach by the resistance themselves. Hamas rockets fired untargeted into Israeli civilian space. It's impossible to target the Qassams in the way that they claim they can. They're random where they land. And when you hear Mohammed Daif, the leader of Hamas, say, we fight in a moral war, it's fair enough to, it is an interesting thing to hear, and I heard it repeated immediately after he said that on the Tuesday night by Palestinian civilians. But the problem is that, as I'll come to, I think there is a lot of doublespeak and doublethink going on in both sides in this war that has a potential to lead to to catastrophic human outcomes bigger than the ones we've even seen so far. And that is one of them. When you do one thing, but you declare that your aim is another. The other thing is, obviously, firing from within populated areas. I would say the large part of the population tolerates that and accepts it. Nevertheless, if a military force did it, there would be an inquiry as to why they were doing it. So moving to some specifics, the UNRWA school on the 30th of July was shelled around about 5 o'clock. That's one of 3 big impacts that hit the toilet block. So the allegation that there was mortar fire nearby, the witnesses I spoke to said that they had heard explosions nearby, but not nearby. Later investigations, not me, says it was probably 200 meters away. So let's presume there was mortar fire going out from the resistance. So obviously mortar fire is technically targeted. It is targeted at, they're shooting at something nearby, probably the Israeli military, at Erez, which is just about 2 or 3 kilometers to the north. So the population, there were about 3,000 people in that school, and they were told to go into the shelters. There's 2 kinds of shelters. If you look at it like this, facing Erez Crossing at the top, there are a 2-story concrete block of school rooms, and then there's a yard, and then down here there is what they call an asbestos block of breeze blocks, single-story houses. Now, most people went into the concrete blocks, and a few people went into the breeze blocks, which is just not advisable. They're told not to do it. That thing we just saw, that was near the breeze block at the south end of the facility, and that's where most of the people who were killed. 21 people were killed, 100 injured. Now, I rang the Israelis. While we were there, we saw an explosion nearby, which turned out to be another Israeli shell landing on the Jabalya market at 10:30 a.m. And by the time we got to the hospital at Beit Hanun, there was already the casualties there, civilians again, killed and injured from another shelling. And I rang the Israelis and said, well, what are your rules of engagement for shelling into an area that is largely breeze block and full of civilians who've already moved, as the Bedouin have to move from the open areas where they live to the north into Beit Hanun and Jabalya? And they said, we do not discuss rules of engagement ever. Now, I think, I've had some contact with UK military, and I think the British Armed Forces would certainly have an intense discussion about any rule of engagement that allowed them to fire willy-nilly into an area that looks like this. This is the view from where the first, I should finish the story. The first shell landed at the north side on the big 2-story block, and it just above where that photograph was taken from. People spilled out into the yard. The second shell landed the other side, beyond where those trees are, that's where the small blocks were, and the other one landed just outside the other side and killed lots of animals. So, if you're an artillery person, you don't go on site, you're firing indirectly. What are you firing at? Coordinates. You put into your artillery piece the coordinates, X and Y, where you're firing at. And if we take that one of them hit just where that photograph was taken from, and 2 hit just where that yellow roof is, where the trees are, you'd have to say that the point they were firing at was the middle of the yard. There's no doubt about what they were doing. These are not inaccurate weapons. Now, I picked up and reported on there and then, and have here with me, hoping it isn't depleted uranium, bits and bobs of the shrapnel that was from the southern impacts. Now, these will cut your fingers if you just hold them. And the other thing about them is people get obsessed with flechette bombs or cluster bombs. And you saw the injuries that Mads, I think, showed earlier. The guy in black and white line on his side. That's what that does, okay? And I'm sure you know better than I, because you must have taken so many of it out of people. So the point about high explosive artillery shells, 155 millimeters wide and about that high, is that that's what they become, yeah? And you can have a look at that on the panel and pass it along if you fancy it. But do be careful. Right, that's what landed there when 3,000 people were sleeping there. So that has to be investigated, as does this problem of rules of engagement, of firing. Look, one other thing. There's, I don't know if I've got a little pointer on here, is there one? Is there a thing where, yeah. See, look at these places here. That's Jabalya. And really, you have to, if you said to I don't know about the US military, but if you said to a UK officer, I'm going to fire a salvo of artillery into this area, and I think they'd say, what is the risk to us, you know, of breaching international law? Because it looks to me, with 3,000 people sleeping there, we might commit a breach. So now I'm going to talk just briefly about Khazar. We were stuck, as were most Western journalists, in Gaza City for quite a long time because of the inability to move around. But on Friday the 1st of August, there was a long ceasefire declared that looked like it might be able to be, you could move around. So we started driving south. And what happened, the story of Khazar was already begun to be told. There's a long road east of Khan Yunis going out to this village of Khazar, which had been flattened. And people on it, you can look my reports up, they just search for Channel 4, it's all available. We're milling around trying to get the dead people who'd been killed a long time ago and see what was happening in Khazar. But as we went out there, it became obvious that something was going on. We had a tip-off that there was indeed an Israeli soldier missing, but we had no idea it was so close to where Khazar was, like 7 kilometers from Rafah, where he went missing. So what then happened is that we found ourselves on this long road with a very open housing in the middle of what I would call widespread suppressive artillery fire. So what that is what they do is if you're an artillery person, you're told that we need to keep people out of this area and kill everything in it. So you fire random shells into a particular area. It's not like targeting. And that's what it felt like, 3 or 4 impacts per minute. There was supposed to be a ceasefire. So all along the ridge, you know, the ridge of the hills, from the ridge of the hills, you can see Israel. It's only 2 kilometers away. All along the ridge were farmers peering over, trying to get to their farms. They hadn't been there for 2 weeks. And in the middle of that, these things start falling. Also, it was the only time I had the experience of the red line situation, because we saw youths running up to go and try and find out what was happening and coming back really being carried injured by what they claimed was sniper fire. I think it's more likely to have been ordinary assault rifle fire, but basically they crossed somebody's red line. Then we went to the hospital to do what we were doing, you know, reporting all the time about what was going on the casualties. And because Rafah by then was being hit very hard, and some of the casualties had taken from Rafah to Khan Yunis. After we finished in Khan Yunis, we tried to leave, and even in Khan Yunis, we came across this pattern of random shelling. So this here is Khan Yunis Hospital. So Khazar will be over here, yeah, right over here. But that's Khan Yunis Hospital, which, you know, was treating 96 casualties on that day. And we're trying to drive out, and if you look, I've just tried to put them roughly where I remember them being. Basically, the shells firing, even around us, the driver's going, yank, move, you know, and then another one lands. So this has to be explained. And if I could get hold of the tape of what happened on that day there, I think you would be there's a case to answer. The Commission's talking about genocide. I think, as far as my understanding of the 1948 Convention, because it involves mental and physical, that it involves the intent to genocide, I feel, having lived there for 10 days, albeit not being able to move around, I didn't feel that I was on the receiving end of a genocidal massacre. But I want to warn both the Commission, the Tribunal, and anybody else who's listening, including the IDF, and including Hamas, that there are genocidal narratives, and I've said this on air, on both sides. So I heard, having people who'd lived under 21, 22 days of bombardment, seen their children terrified, neighbours killed, homes flattened, perfectly secular, educated people, say, it looks like they're trying to kill all of us. Maybe there's not room for us, for both races on the planet anymore. That's what I've heard. People who've been totally secular, non-Islamist Palestinians start to say. And you heard earlier this narrative of genocidal narrative in the Israeli social media. And I think what I'd say is that this creates a specific threat. There's a specific threat we must warn of as journalists and international interlocutors, that the social media, it creates a reality in people's minds that where you don't need an order. You don't need an order to do something. Now, with that in mind, I'll finish on this. I think both sides had unrealistic expectations. And what I mean by that, you've got to finish the job. You saw that sexist and racist thing with the woman in the hijab, the pornographic thing about finishing the job. But the bigger problem with finish the job is it's a fantasy. The idea that the Israeli army could roll into the whole of Gaza, occupy it, root out Hamas, without killing tens of thousands of people is nonsense. So people who fantasize about finishing the job should know that what they are fantasizing about is the killing of tens of thousands, not 2,000, tens of thousands of people, right? Likewise, among the population of Gaza, especially the young, there is a widespread belief that if the Israelis rolled in and occupied, that they would all be killed, that the Israelis would be defeated. This is encouraged by the resistance. And I think the problem with it is that it all leads to what I've called the scope for miscalculation. That is a Srebrenica-style outcome. Maybe, organised, we don't know at what level, by anybody. But I do fear, having spent time there, that there is a lot of scope for a miscalculation to create mass civilian death. And I would urge all sides, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas and the Israelis and the international community, that the need for vigilance on genocide concerns the modern forms of genocide. And I don't just mean not like the Holocaust, not like the Shoah, but also not like Rwanda. Rwanda was analog. Rwanda was done through radio stations that we have recordings of. The real problem, as we find in many conflicts we cover, is the social media and informal networks allow genocidal thoughts, which of course are the critical thing, to occur and to guide action. And this is what we must prevent in any future conflict. Thank you.
Can I start with one question? These atrocities have been carried out really in front of our eyes, unlike past occasions. And one question that we're left with is, why has it been allowed to continue? And connected to that is what I want to ask you, is are you aware of pressure to modify the report?
No.
And where does it come from? Because the reports that we saw from you were, to many of us, markedly different to the reports that we saw on other channels, which makes us suspect that there is a pressure, maybe not at reporter level, but at a higher editorial level, to modify the report. And are you aware of that, and does it play into the news?
Look, I spent 12 years working with the BBC, but I never covered Israel-Palestine. That's the first thing. The other thing is, I never saw the output of the rest of TV because I was in Gaza for 10 days with no access to it. So I can't, what I will say is about the atmosphere in which I work, and in Channel 4. And there is no pressure to modify reports whatsoever. There is, of course, editorial concern because we are regulated, and either side, the Palestinian side or the Israeli side, can complain to our regulator that we have miscovered. And therefore, I would say there is more vigilance than on a normal story, and I think that is right. The other thing is that we have certain rules, so for example, when we did cover, in fact, show twice on the same bulletin, a piece by me about the social media and a piece from my colleague Jonathan Miller about the event itself, the shooting of that guy in Sharjah. And what we can't do is show the moment of death because we're just not allowed to show the moment of death. I mean, to try and give, this is a problem that we all, that we have. Some of those pictures that shocked some of you, of course, we are seeing all the time in covering that conflict. But, you know, even, for example, the rules we work under, at one point we tried to shoot, at the UNRWA school, there were a lot of donkeys killed, and the donkeys had the same injuries as the human beings. And we shot what had happened to the donkeys, but in the end, it was decided that we couldn't even show that, because the rules, that we don't make them up, the rules of the regulator of British television would not allow us to show the injuries to the animals. No.
I have a question. I think it's really for the lawyers, but I really would like it cleared. Now, if a civilian population is being bombed and killed, and the young people there say that if the people who are bombing and killing them roll into town, they will kill them all, does this amount to genocidal intent?
I don't, look, I can't. Yeah, that's the problem. All we can do is record what we hear. And I think that the story I've just told you is a valuable story because it's something that an independent journalist with no skin in the game, you know, I'm not a Middle East expert, hadn't been to Gaza before, can tell you, you know, by telling you the story, all I can do is provide the evidence. And I think this problem of unrealistic expectation. The other problem I'd say, many fathers took us aside in the UNRWA schools we went to and said, my kids have never met an Israeli. They said, I used to sleep like brothers with them on the floor of the farms when we were agricultural workers before 2006-07, but now we've got no ability to, and you know, so the otherization that you're seeing in the social media there is also, unfortunately, happening to this growing generation of Palestinians in Gaza who have no opportunity whatsoever to interface with any Jewish Israeli whatsoever.
Michael.
Yes, just one question. Again, it's to do with genocide. I think in the context of an incarcerated population, do you agree that what we should be looking at in relation to this is the element, and I'm going to read it out again, it's been mentioned once earlier on, the deliberate infliction on a group of conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part?
I think that is the thing, it's point 3 of the 1948 Convention, of the 5 actions. It is certainly the one that I would focus on. The problem is it's one of the actions, it's not part of the intent. So the intent, you'd have to prove genocidal intent in the minds of those who ordered it. Because the in-part thing, I think one of the doctors I interviewed in Shifa when we were there basically said to me that 30 or 40 families, he was a Palestinian doctor, 30 or 40 families had disappeared from the register. It would certainly make me want to ask, what is going on with the targeting of families? But you're a lawyer, I'm not. That, to me, even the thing you've read out, is on the action side and not the intent side.
I'm under instructions to finish, but can I ask you one brief final question? We heard very good reports of the events as they unfolded day by day. We didn't hear, and it's not a criticism of you because it wasn't, you were on the ground reporting those events, but we didn't hear the long perspective of the struggle of the Palestinians to end the blockade, to end the settler movement, which put these events into perspective. Now, do you have any answers as to why that should be?
I think I work at the end of the media that is, as who said it earlier, you know, it's the end that 4 minutes is your maximum. Okay. Now, when there are things like this going on the ground, all you can do is to try and document what's going on. The act of documenting, I think, is important. And what I decided to do while I was there was almost become quite sort of Rain Man-esque in my complete sort of focus on detail, because I think that is the best thing you can do. Now, I think it is important that we in the media do reflect the wider narrative and clash of narrative of what is going on in the wider Middle East. But I think that almost like thank goodness for the internet, thank goodness that millions of people now have access to many information sources and can construct their own version of it. I wouldn't like anybody to read any single version of what has happened in the Middle East because it is so complex.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. I'm afraid we have to end it there. Thank you for...
Okay, can I just ask just one question, just extremely briefly? Paul, I think the most important thing you said was that this whole war, the 50 days, has been recorded.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's really, really important. It's the first time I've ever heard that, with the triangulation, that the evidence is there. So in relation to the school in particular, which had such high profile, 21 dead, 100 injured, do you know if any journalist or any broadcasting organisation has asked the Israeli army to release the information and the video footage or the technical footage that they have in relation to that incident?
I don't. I think it's something that, that is certainly, if the Israeli media hasn't done it, we should do it. Of course, as you said before, they're working on the censorship, so they will not do it. But the point about it is to remember that, of course, the other things, there is satellite imagery. You know, so things like missiles, the anti-missile system, the Iron Dome, works because it intercepts things, because it sees them through radar and presumably, we don't know, satellite. So everything is recorded, and certain things. So you know, so even things like the who bombed Shifa, who attacked Shifa. Was it a misfire of a Qasim, or was it the Israelis? Could be solved by showing the recording on the satellite. Cheers.
Thanks, Paul.